episode of Your Right to Know, brought to you by the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. My name is Andrew Couture. I'll be your co-host this evening, and with me as always is my friend and co-host, Mary Lotze. Hello, Mary. How are you doing today?
Hi, Andrew.
And today, our topic for the show is a detailed discussion on HD4420, an act modernizing firearms law, which is currently being discussed up on Beacon Hill at this point in time. Our guest for this evening is Tom Swenson. Tom Swenson is a Second Amendment advocate and a friend of the FRCC. As a way to set the stage for the discussion today, I'd like you, Tom, to introduce yourself to our viewing audience, letting people know why you support the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms.
Thanks. I'm Tom Swenson. I'm a licensed gun owner living here in Fitchburg. The right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental human right. It extends from the right of self-defense that God grants to every living thing. It's very important for all of us to remember that history shows the worst mass murders are committed by government actors, not deranged individuals. One need only look at Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Communist China, Cambodia, Uganda, etc. Unarmed civilians are extremely vulnerable to abuses by rogue governments. Our founding fathers were acutely aware of this, having just thrown off a tyrannical government, and that's why we have a Second Amendment.
Well, thank you for that, Tom.
Thank you. That's very well said.
That is very well said, and you hit the nail on the head. And I think it's also important to note that all the instances that you talk about, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Communist China, Cambodia, they all had their firearm rights taken away from them just prior to these atrocities happening. In fact, you can even look down in South America as well, where what was it, Uruguay? That they Bolivia. They took away everybody's guns, and then in came the tyrannical government, and within a matter of a few years, went from a thriving country all the way down to a mass murdering, mass murderers.
Gangs.
Yeah, gangs and whatnot. But thank you for that, Tom. That was great. And tonight we're going to be discussing the newly proposed state legislative act that is HD 4420, which is called the Act Modernizing Firearms Law, which is, let's just say, a joke. But you have your own name for this, Tom. What do you call this bill?
I call this the post-Bruin Temper Tantrum.
And I agree with you. And the reason why some of our viewing audience might not know, the Supreme Court just handed down a ruling about a year ago. It was the New York Sports and Pistol and Rifle Association versus Bruin. This is a case that came out of New York, where in essence the New York basically said that you cannot take your firearm out of the house unless you are going to an approved range within the city of New York, and basically making it impossible for an average citizen to get a firearms license in New York. So this got called up all the way to the Supreme Court, and the decision basically struck down New York's May issue permitting scheme, which we currently still have in Massachusetts, even though I consider it unconstitutional. But the court said that the interest balancing test can't be used anymore, which is still actually used in Massachusetts.
Now, what does that mean, the interest balancing?
So basically, they have to have a compelling governmental interest in order to be able to say that a person is unable to have, a firearm. And of course, what they hang their hat on all the time, well, we do this for safety reasons, okay? Well, and to kind of quash, guns getting into the hands of the wrong people. Well, guess what? Criminals don't give a lick about the current, what their firearms are. Right, exactly. So, so basically what the court struck down is they cannot use this balancing test anymore. In fact, what the court did say is that they have to look at the text, the history, and tradition of what the history of the firearms law in the country is supposed to be, which it flies in the face of all of the anti-gun states, California, New York, Massachusetts, you name it. If they don't want guns in people's hands because they want an unarmed citizenry. So, but anyways, Tom, if I were to list every way this, can you list every way this bill infringes on our Second Amendment rights?
If I did that, we'd be here for 3 or 4 days. There are just so many infringements in this bill. They took everything New York, New Jersey, and California did, and they piled on more.
Now,
And
who are
more,
they?
and more.
Who are they?
They're the people that drafted this legislation. This legislation came out of Representative Day, who happens to be chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Massachusetts House.
Okay.
And prior to this legislation, they conducted a listening tour, but nobody was listening.
weren't.
They weren't, no. They certainly weren't listening to law-abiding gun owners.
Right.
That's for certain.
Or people who believe in the U.S. Constitution.
That's correct. That's correct. But here's just a few. I'm just going to give you just a couple of examples of the infringements that are going on. First of all, this bill greatly increases the training requirements to obtain firearms in the firearms license in the Commonwealth, to the point where many working people find the time and expense required to obtain a license will just be simply unaffordable. It takes too much time and too much money. And if you're just some average Joe that's working for a living, it starts to become out of reach.
Oh, Tom, just to continue on that, we already have a pretty strict licensing requirement as it is.
We absolutely do. As a matter of fact, I just applied to renew my license, and the wait time right now is 4 months. Can you imagine the uproar that would occur at the Registry of Motor Vehicles if they told people, hey, we can't renew your license for 4 months?
Yeah.
Here's
Or
your-
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's
exactly.
why I tell my clients and my students whenever I teach a class because I teach classes in gun law. That's why I always tell my students, take a look at your license, start the application process 6 months prior.
6 months.
Yeah. It redefines firearms parts such as frames, receivers, and barrels to be firearms. Each one of those components requires a separate serial number. Now, typically, on most firearms, the barrel is not serialized.
Well, and the barrel, explain, is just that long tube that the bullet will go through.
Exactly. And on many firearms, barrels are highly interchangeable. And that's something I'll get into a little bit later. So they're requiring serialization, and this is going to come up again. They're requiring serialization on parts that the industry typically doesn't serialize, and the federal government doesn't require it. No other state requires it. So that right there is creating a barrier for Massachusetts, because then companies have to invest the time and the resources to serialize these items for what's a fairly small market share when you look at the national scene.
And what is the purpose behind doing something like that? I know I watch enough crime shows when a crime has been committed and they look at the striations on a bullet that's been fired.
But that's not the serial number.
But is that the reason behind it, so they can follow?
No, the reason behind it truly is to monitor people building their own firearms, which is completely legal right now. You can build your own firearms here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But they're trying to, number one, make it impossible for somebody to build their own firearm, and number two, basically bankrupt the entire gun industry because
making it onerous.
I'm almost positive that Remington, Glock, any of the major firearm businesses within the country is not going to stop production the way they are now just to be able to placate Massachusetts, gun laws.
Sure.
And it gets worse, because one of the things that this bill does is it requires you to notify the state and provide them with a list of parts for any modification to a firearm. Now, it's beyond absurd. If you, like for example, a hunter, that has a shotgun in the state, a lot of hunters will have a shotgun with 2 barrels. They'll have a field barrel, a long barrel
For bird hunting.
for bird hunting, for pheasants and that kind of thing, where they're shooting bird shot at long ranges. And then they'll have a shorter barrel with rifle sights on it called a slug barrel that they will use come after
season.
Thanksgiving. They
Yeah.
put that on and they go out and they hunt deer.
Okay.
So just to do that, you would have to file paperwork with the state. And even just other plain modifications is things like mounting an optic. If you want to swap out a scope or add a scope to a firearm, that requires even something as simple as putting a light on your home defense pistol, so that you can be sure of your target in a life-threatening emergency.
Yeah.
It's just beyond ridiculous.
Isn't there something also loaders, gun loaders?
Yes, and that gets to another part. All ammunition feeding devices, and that's not just magazines. That's everything. That's like a speed loader for a revolver. It's a fixed magazine, like a tubular magazine, like typically on a 22 caliber rifle. A lot of them, the semi-automatic 22 caliber rifle will have a tube magazine beneath it. Those would have to be serialized, as would a tubular magazine on like a lever action rifle, like your grandpa's 30-30, that he would take up to Maine and hunt with.
But I think again, as it states right now, the federal government does not require. Let's just take magazines, like a normal magazine for your home defense pistol. You could go. Of course, we have the magazine limit as it stands right now. So if you go to your local gun shop and you get a magazine for your, an extra magazine for your home self-defense pistol, you would go to the store and just pick one up off the shelf. Of course, it has to be no more than 10 rounds. But these manufacturers will not just stop production and say, okay, now we have to serialize everything because that's what Massachusetts says we have to do. And it's going to be impossible to find a magazine here in Massachusetts for any type of firearm. And it's not like you can just go right up the road to New Hampshire, because if you go to New Hampshire, you're going to get what the gun manufacturers properly suggest as a full-size magazine, which could be anywhere from 12 to 15 rounds. And a lot of people are like, well, the state of Massachusetts is, limits to 10. What's 2 extra rounds?
Right.
What's 5 extra rounds?
Right.
Really, I mean, it makes no difference. How many bullets you have in a gun. They're doing this to say, oh, it's safety reasons because we don't want people carrying 5 extra rounds. That's kind of ridiculous.
And it gets worse. Getting back to your point, Andrew, about driving legitimate gun-related businesses out of business. The bill changes the definition of safe storage of a firearm. Now, we have laws for safe storage of firearms, and they're changing that definition, stating that a container, like your gun safe or whatever you put your firearms in to lock them up, must deter all but the most persistent from gaining access. Now, what the heck does that mean?
Well, that's subjective.
It's a vague, arbitrary, and highly subjective term, and it's done purposefully to basically trip people up.
Well, it's not written into the law as it's written right now, but the case law actually states that it has to deter all but the most persistent from gaining access. I run into this quite frequently.
I bet you do.
In my legal career, because you have people. I take a case that I just recently worked on, where an individual had his firearms in his house. He was going back and forth from his house, which was in a different town, to his girlfriend's house, and basically bouncing back and forth. Well, it was some time before he went back to his house. And
that's his house is where his safe
is, and he also had firearms because the girlfriend lives on a farm, so he also had firearms over there. But what he didn't know was somebody broke into his house
while he was gone.
And it was some time before he went back to that house, and the burglars who went into his house ransacked the place, took anything of value, and while they were searching searching the house, they found the combination to the safe. Opened up the safe, took all the firearms. Now, it was the burglar's wife who reported him in that he was selling these stolen firearms. And the licensing authority revoked his license, or suspended his license, I should say, because they were saying that he didn't store them properly. No, he did store them properly. And let's face it, if somebody's going to ransack somebody's house, I would say they're pretty persistent. And that was the argument that I argued in this case. And I'm still waiting on the results, but even the judge was like, this is pretty clear that this is a violation of this man's rights.
Sure.
So, so I'm working on that, but I see it quite a bit, in my legal career when people are storing their firearms properly. They use this to say, well, you didn't stop even the most persistent person.
Because it's what is persistent but subjective.
Right. It's
Right.
completely subjective.
Yeah.
Right,
How
and that's my
persistent
point.
is persistent?
Exactly.
And another thing I find the problem with, as you explained it, is just the transportation of weapons. I mean, that's pretty
Right, and this is going
defined.
into my next point. They're also applying these requirements to retailers, basically saying that a secured room or a vault is not sufficient, and that they have to, I guess, use safes or something. And they're also extending this requirement to your common carriers, FedEx, UPS. Now, gun businesses ship their inventory
the
like
time.
every other retail location
All the
does
time.
through common carriers. Now, they go from one FFL to another, from a manufacturer distributor to another, but it's all the same common carriers. So, and furthermore, they're requiring that these employees have a license to carry, and that is really prohibitive. That's really prohibitive.
My guess or my question is, the local FedEx guy, does the FedEx person even know they're carrying a weapon when they deliver a box?
Not usually.
Unless, I mean, my box comes with Chewy, so I assume you could assume it's animal food or pet food.
Right.
But my box from Prime just says Prime.
Right.
They don't know what's inside.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I mean, you're going to see, long boxes coming in, with rifles in them that say Remington or whatnot. But I mean, I don't know if you've hung out at, at your local FFL. I had a very close friend of mine who's a friend of the FRCC, who owned his own firearm,
Sure.
Federal firearms license, and had a store in Templeton. And I was there when he was getting deliveries because he was a friend.
Sure.
We'd sit, we'd have coffee, and shoot the breeze for a little bit. And I'd see these come in. They'd come in on a pallet, wrapped in cellophane. And of course, I mean, this is a common carrier, UPS, FedEx. That would be, they're all secured anyways when they close the door. So I mean, it's already secure. But to actually require the license, the person to be licensed in order to deliver, that's just going to say, FedEx is going to say, we're not going to do this
Right,
anymore.
that's like a bridge too far.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but isn't there also a provision that states that you can't carry your firearm on private property without the express written permission of the property owner?
That's correct, and that's something that New York has done, that they've borrowed from New York, and that's currently being fought over in the courts.
Okay. And then also there's a whether or not you're carrying a weapon. If a police officer comes to say pulls you over or something like that,
Sure.
and they request, can I see your firearms license? You got to provide it.
And if you don't provide it, they'll revoke it.
Right. Right.
I mean,
But
it's
what
just-
if
As it stands right
That's
now,
absurd.
Massachusetts is you don't have to disclose. It's a non-disclosure state that if you're in possession of a firearm, you don't have to disclose that, like in a traffic stop or something like that. This would change that, and actually give it having to present your firearm license, even though you're not carrying or you don't have one in the vehicle. But it takes what we currently have and just turns it onto its head. Now, if you're not doing anything illegal and, everything's proper, you're carrying it right, whatnot, or you have it stored properly, you don't have to disclose that. But what I normally tell my clients and my students, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the big deal? But this would turn it into a big deal.
But what if people don't even carry their license to carry LIC with them unless they might have it in their satchel where they would carry their weapon?
Right.
They don't just, we have how many IDs in our wallet as it is
the
now?
requirement is you would pretty much have to have it.
On your
All the
person
time.
Yeah,
all the
it'd be like
time.
American Express, don't leave home without it.
Wow.
So, Tom, the Democrats attempted to take our U.S. and state constitutional rights, clearly stated in the Second Amendment, let's face it, it's a gun grab by any other name. You have statistics to show that the crimes committed with firearms are not being committed by the law-abiding citizens that actually go by the law, but by criminals, gang members who do not follow the laws and the rules. Do you have those statistics to point out?
I looked for available crime statistics as far as licensure of the perpetrator, and I couldn't find any. They typically, in the publicly available stats that I searched, are not broken out. But what I can say is that during the listening tour that preceded this bill, even the anti-gun people conceded that fact, that licensed gun owners are not the problem. And as a matter of fact, the Springfield police superintendent, a woman by the name of Cheryl Claprud, said licensed gun owners are not the issue, and added lawmakers should concentrate to create legislation that would address the small percentage of criminals who are repeat violent criminal offenders, which is something I've been saying for decades. We are not the problem. Law-abiding licensed gun owners, first of all, the vetting process we have to go through. You pretty much have to be a saint to get an LTC in the Commonwealth. A simple drunk driving conviction
That's true.
will disqualify you.
Or any type of domestic.
Any type of domestic. I've even seen people who have gotten their license suspended or denied, I should say, just because they have a couple of restraining orders on their record. That might be
By history.
By history, like 20 years old. They were in a bad marriage 20 years ago. The divorce went through. Haven't had a problem ever since. He's now distanced himself from the person, and the person
Gone
that
on with their life.
got the restraining orders against him. Nothing's been, but they still say, well, that's concerning behavior. Well, not when you're also dealing with a divorce. That's actually kind of consistent, pretty much, not all the time, but you do see, abuses being used in order to get the upper hand in a divorce proceeding to, try to keep the husband or try to keep the wife away, from the marital home.
Sure.
So.
I look at this, so I'm not involved with weapons per se myself. However, I am I support the Constitution, and I believe in our constitutional rights. And my concern is this is a gun grab. This is truly an action against our Second Amendment rights. Why are the Democrats, and this is a Democrat by and large sponsored bill, because that's all that's up on Beacon Hill is Democrats.
Except for a few select few,
a few select Republicans who are up there. Why are the Democrats out to, A, get our Second Amendment rights, confiscate those rights from us, but also our other rights? We're coming off the heels of COVID, and we saw what our federal legislators and our state legislatures did right in our own state to take away our rights, our freedoms during COVID, about leaving our homes, wearing masks, not going places, not worshiping, not seeing relatives unless you were vaxxed up the wazoo. This is a constant erosion of our constitutional rights that's happening with our rights and our amendment. What is going on? Nobody's saying anything about it. It's like open season on taking away our rights.
The other day I heard an interesting comment, and that COVID caused a lot of people in government to test the boundaries of their power by instituting lockdowns and threatening people's jobs if they don't get the shot, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, in far too many instances, they never found what those boundaries were.
Right.
And this is an old saying, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And silence is acceptance. So nobody says anything, they're just going to keep on pushing.
Right.
Well, I think one thing that was exposed during the COVID crisis as well is people were in a panic, especially in the very beginning of the COVID crisis. And you had people, anti-gun people, that were going into gun shops, you know, saying, look, you know,
I'm fearful.
bad stuff is happening right
Yes.
now. I need something to protect my house. I just want a simple shotgun or whatnot. And they go into an FFL and they're just, look, just give me a simple pump shotgun. That's all that I want, you know. And the store owner's like, okay, great. Let me see your FID or license to carry. And they're like, what do you mean? It's like, well, no, you need a license in this state. Oh, well, the media just said that all I have to do is come in and you know, I can get one. Or if I go to a gun show, I can use the gun show loophole.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? There's no such thing as a gun show
Right.
loophole.
This is all sort of magnified rhetoric that's not true. But people hear it after a terrible mass shooting, and I don't want to diminish terrible mass shootings, they happen. But people hear that rhetoric and they glom on it, and they're, I hate to tell you, gentlemen, but we've just run out of time.
Well, before we end for this evening, and this has been a very quick show with a lot more information that we could provide, but you got to get out there. If you're a gun owner, you got to get out there and talk to your representative. If you're a Fitchburg resident, contact State Representative Couture. Tell them to vote no on this. Right as it stands, as we're taping this, there's been a delay in the discussion of this bill to go past the August recess of the representatives, but they're going to be bringing it back up when the show airs in September. So this is not over. Get your voices heard. Start contacting your representatives as soon as possible.
We thank you for sitting in and watching Your Right to Know with the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. These are your rights. Are you willing to sit there, watch the show, and give your constitutional rights away? We've seen it through COVID. We've seen it many times now. These are your rights. Fight for them. Thank you and good night.
America, we stand for freedom. So let us all use values that preserves our rights and goes forth in power and might, that reflects our values and preserves our rights and goes forth in power and might.
We do.
Yeah.
I was thinking of that. We need